on today's show, we're going to look back at our biggest hits and misses from the 2024 fantasy football season. The point of this exercise is not to brag or to needle. It's to try to think through why a player hit or missed and see if there's something useful we can take forward from that, just in an effort to get better. First one is going to be a hit, Jahmyr Gibbs. And this was the kind of play coming into the season I think some older school fantasy players just did not want to make. They did not want to make the Gibbs pick in round 1 or at the round 2 turn because he wasn't the quote unquote starter. He wasn't the goal line back due to Dave Montgomery. But just bet on the offense, bet on raw talent, bet on upside in case of Dave Montgomery injury. And both Evan and I were on Gibbs as a target. He ends up finishing as the running back 2 in points per game. So really good hit here on being aggressive, Jahmyr Gibbs, end of round 1, early round 2. Evan, any takeaways for you from the Gibbs situation this season?
Just made a good call. He led the NFL in rushing touchdowns. He led the NFL in touchdowns from scrimmage. It's funny. I saw another fantasy analyst right after the regular season saying, well, do we think that Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be a first-round pick in 2025? Well, we had him as a first-round pick in 2024. So Sometimes you nail it, and that's what we did here. Great offensive line, betting on the offense. That was a winning strategy for virtually every member of the Detroit Lions offense this year.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as the NFL has changed, some people who've been playing fantasy football since, the 90s or the early 2000s, it's hard to get your head around a timeshare back being a round 1 pick. And I think kind of moving past that, and we'll get to Achane, we'll get some other guys like that soon, but I think getting past that is an important part of being strong at the running back position at fantasy year, and obviously just identifying Gibbs as just a total Jamal Charles, Chris Johnson-esque kind of talent also.
Absolutely. And it's also important to remember with situations like this that he always had a really high floor, because even if David Montgomery had stayed healthy the entire season, Jahmyr Gibbs was going to help you. But he gets that ceiling when David Montgomery misses some time, and then he's an absolute league winner. So high floor, high ceiling. These are the kind of players that you want to bet in and year out.
All right. Second one to go over from early round hits and misses is probably the biggest miss I've ever had since I've been doing this. I think Evan and I both were mostly out on Saquon Barkley. He finished as the RB1 in points per game. I just wasn't on it. And just really, really painful. The crazy thing about this is that the concerns that we had did play out in some fashion. Jalen Hurts stole 14 rushing touchdowns from Saquon Barkley, majority of them from the 1-yard line on the tush push. Also, Jalen Hurts did not throw to Saquon Barkley a ton, only 2.7 targets per game. I mean, Saquon only got 17 receiving yards per game. So if you tell me that a running back's quarterback is going to score 14 times and he's only going to exceed 2.7 targets per game, I would have been like, yeah, that's a pretty good fade in round 1 or round 2. I think what we didn't see coming, at least for me, was a few things that I can get into. But the biggest thing is just the Eagles being one of the most run-heavy teams in the entire NFL, which I really did not see coming. Saquon ends up with just an outrageous workload here. But yeah, Evan, any thoughts on probably the worst mistake that we've had, definitely since we've started ETR?
Yeah, it's funny the way you put it, because it was very spot on. It's crazy to be that right about a situation and be that as wrong as we were about Saquon Barkley in 2024, because as you mentioned, the tush push was a big concern, receptions were a big concern, and he still just absolutely crushed it. And I think that at the end of the day, I think we just kind of overthought it. We thought too much about this. Going from the Giants offense to the Eagles offense, Saquon Barkley, and he stayed healthy, which, I mean, he has a history. He has a pretty lengthy history of ankle stuff. He stayed healthy. But I think we just underestimated and maybe even overlooked how big of a jump that was going to be, going from the Giants to the Eagles. And he just absolutely took off. One of the best running back seasons of my lifetime.
Sure. And I'll say a couple more things. First, I also thought that Gainwell and or Shipley would play more. I mean, Gainwell and Shipley only combined for 105 carries in 17 games, and that includes the Week 18 game when Barkley sat out. And then also just on efficiency, though, this is the one that hurts because, as Evan said, when you go from the Giants' offensive line and the Giants' scheme and the Giants' personnel to the Eagles, maybe we should have projected a way bigger spike in efficiency. 5.8 yards per carry on 345 carries for Saquon is just absolutely wild. But maybe given the offensive line improvement and how well this team runs the ball, maybe we should have seen that coming. I mean, we saw DeAndre Swift have really good efficiency for the Eagles and then go to other teams and just fall off the face of the earth, And so that was definitely one regret. But as Evan said, just try not to overthink it. There's very few teams where the running back is the man on their team and is also a freak talent, and the team has a really good offensive line. And so we probably just overthought it from that perspective. Just close your eyes and make the bet there and not overthink the tush push and the receiving and game well and everything.
It's one of these situations where I regret it so much because I just wish I would have been like in line with market as opposed to being lower than market. In a situation like this, I just totally blew it.
Okay. Let's go to a hit in the early rounds was Malik Neighbors. Everyone was scared off by the quarterback situation here. Daniel Jones is just the worst. He's not going to be able to get Malik Neighbors the ball. And honestly, I was a little scared too. I mean, I was only taking Malik Neighbors in like early middle round 3, but that was still way above market. Silva was even higher. I mean, Silva had Neighbors in the top 150 in round 2 there. I think just talent plus volume, right? And if Marvin Harrison was not in this wide receiver class, maybe people would have been falling all over themselves more to get Malik Neighbors. But yeah, big hit for you, Evan, on Malik Neighbors. Any takeaways for you on this one?
I think that looking into a coach's history, like with Brian Daboll, can be helpful in a situation like this because he showed the ability. And you remember people didn't believe. I mean, obviously Josh Allen has become one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, but Stephon Diggs goes to Buffalo, and that's back when people were skeptical still of Josh Allen, betting on Brian Daboll to be able to scheme an offense that can just feed the football, regardless of quarterback play, feed the football to an individual player like this. I mean, he had 170 targets or something like that.
Yeah, so 11.3 targets per game for Neighbors led the entire NFL.
Yeah, and he is the kind of player that can create separation consistently. Bet on talent, bet on coaching history. It didn't matter. Actually, when Drew Lock came in, Malik Neighbors was even better than when Daniel Jones was in there.
Absolutely. And yeah, I don't think that people don't understand how much volume matters. And there's going to be a lot of garbage time. That was fine for Malik Neighbors. That was, in fact, good for Malik Neighbors. Again, 170 targets in 15 games. That is the Daboll stuff that Evan was talking about. So, yeah, really nice hit there on Neighbors. Next one is another wide receiver, and it was a miss. And this was, I think, more me than Evan. But Jalen Waddle, this was a bad miss because there's so much opportunity cost there in round 3 and round 4. And Waddle was unusable. I mean, worst possible run out for Jalen Waddle. Okay, there were games without Tua Tagovailoa. Maybe we can write those off, right? McDaniel did not do a good job getting Skylar Thompson, Tyler Huntley ready to play. But even when Tua was out there, Waddle was largely unplayable or just bad. I mean, I could never have foreseen him getting massively out-targeted and outplayed by Jonnu Smith, especially after the Dolphins gave him a 3-year, $84 million extension prior to this season. He's just 25 years old. I thought he was on the ascent, not descent. So, yeah, Evan, any thoughts on what happened to Jalen Waddle this year?
This was one of the biggest mysteries of the season and one of the toughest situations to see coming. He had only 3 games over 60 yards all year. He had a little bit of injury stuff, but not bad. As you mentioned, a young, theoretically ascending player. The offense just was different this year than it was in past years. You remember in past years, we could really lean on the Dolphins offense because it was funneled to 2 guys and the running back sometimes. But Jalen Waddle, Tyreek Hill, then Jonnu Smith steps in. He's making an impact, and Jalen Waddle almost vanishes. It was I'm not exactly sure what happened, but I tell you what, the offense was different this year than it was in past years, and that was not something that I foresaw at all.
Yeah, I normally think that following the money is like the right strategy, right? If a team really invests a lot of money or a lot of draft capital in a player, I think that's right. I'm just shook by what happened here, where Jalen Waddle gets $84 million extension, and then they're running screens and quick hitters for Jonnu Smith. Like that really,
And if
scared
you
me,
would have told
scares me
me
for sure.
before the season, and if you would have told me before the season that it told me that Tyreek Hill was going to take as big of a step back as he did, I would have been all in on Jalen Waddle. So
Yeah.
I don't know. This was a really, really difficult one, a perplexing fall off for Jalen Waddle.
Let's stay with the Dolphins here for a hit in Devon Achane. There was a lot of talk before the season. You can't take Achane in round 2. You can't take Achane in round 3. He's going to get hurt, right? They're going to try to give him more work. He's going to get hurt. I just always went back to I want players on my fantasy team who can score 40 points for me. And there's not that many guys out there that can do so. There's just not that many guys like Achane or Gibbs and, Barkley, which we didn't see. But yeah, Barkley and guys like that. They can get there in multiple ways. And Achane showed that. Maybe it's crazy efficiency. Maybe it's volume. Or in the case of Achane this season, maybe it's just straight up ridiculous pass catching. Achane efficiency took a big dive in 2024, but 78 catches made him so valuable. This was, I was taking Achane ahead of Barkley, right? And so I don't want to call it a huge hit because that was obviously bad, but I still think that Achane in round 2/round 3 was a hit this season. Evan, any takeaways for you on the Achane stuff?
I feel a little bit lucky on this one. I mean, he scored 6 receiving touchdowns. If you would have told me before the season that his yards per carry would be almost cut in half from his rookie season, I certainly would not have been as in on Devon Achane as I was. So I feel a little bit fortunate, honestly. I mean, but betting on the pass catching certainly came in handy here.
Well, bet on versatile players, and that's the thing with Gibbs and Achane. It's like, yeah, maybe they get bottled up in the run game. Maybe they are not the team's goal line back, but they can go out and catch 8 balls in a game. And, that makes such a huge difference in their floor ceiling combo. So, yeah, I still feel good about that one as a hit. Another hit through the middle rounds was T. Higgins. And the whole strategy that we talked about before the season for season long was that you can get wide receivers like Neighbors, T. Higgins, Waddle, which didn't work out through the early/middle rounds. I think for the most part that strategy worked, and T was a big reason. I just never understood why people didn't like T. I mean, he was going like the 5th round. Yeah, he's hurt a lot, but that's why we have a bench. And he's attached to Joe Burrow, and he showed an ability T. Higgins has to out-earn Jamar Chase in terms of targets for stretches. So I just felt really good about T. Higgins fitting into the strategy that I wanted to employ here and just betting on quarterback talent and wide receiver talent along the way. I know this one seems pretty straightforward. Evan, any more takes on the T. Higgins season?
Yeah, and he missed 5 games.
Yeah.
So he wasn't always out there, but when he was in there, he was a difference maker. I think that the lesson to be learned here is just betting on super stable offensive environments. There was really very little way, aside from Joe Burrow getting injured, which he actually did the previous season. But there was no way that this offense was going to fail as long as Joe Burrow stayed healthy. And he did. He had an unbelievable season. Obviously, people won't remember it because they had it was a losing season. But T. Higgins was a beast, and they're franchise tagging him, right?
Yeah, that's the report.
It sounds like they're franchise tagging him. Yep.
Yeah.
So they're going to keep him.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't, well, we'll get into it, but I still think that they could still trade him, right, despite putting the tag on him. But we'll get into all that for sure as we approach free agency here coming up in March. Yeah, the only other takeaway I would say on T. Higgins, like lessons learned going forward, in season-long fantasy, when you have a bench and you can be active on the wire, I really don't like worrying as much about guys who are quote-unquote injury prone. I think that especially in rounds 4 or 5 on, it's like, yeah, maybe this guy is a little bit more likely than someone else to get hurt because of his history. But when he's out there and he crushes, I much more prefer that than just being safe and stable through there. Let's go to a miss at the running back position. I had a big fade on Alvin Kamara, man. I did not take Alvin Kamara, 29-year-old running back on a potentially bad team, one that had added Jamal Williams, presumably for goal line work, had Taysom Hill as a threat at the goal line, had Kendry Miller in the running back room also. And this just backfired massively. And I guess I regret it a little bit because of the way Kamara scores points. His game is so fantasy friendly, elite pass catcher, and elite around the goal line. But at the same time, like 29-year-old running backs on bad teams is not something I like to invest in. But I do feel like that was cost adjusted. I mean, he was going in like the 7th or 8th round in some spots, at least in best ball. So yeah, Evan, any thoughts on Kamara? Pretty bad miss here, at least by me, of not being in on him at cost.
Yeah, I wasn't particularly in on him either. I almost don't regret this one because I think that the analysis was good and we got a bad result. Remember, we had major concerns about the offensive line. Derek Carr did wind up getting hurt. Jamal Williams, Taysom Hill. I almost don't even regret this one. I'm okay just being wrong sometimes.
Yeah, I will say, like, there's different types of decline at the running back position, like guys who rely so much on speed, like, I don't know, a Chris Johnson, he can hit a wall, I think, faster, or like some power back who isn't good in the pass game, they can hit a wall faster. I guess because Kamara plays so well as a pass catcher and around the goal line, maybe gave him a little bit of a more of a floor. And yeah, I don't really regret it too much. It was just he wasn't expensive. It wasn't expensive to take Alvin Kamara in round 7 or something like that. All right. Let's go to a big hit here for Evan. Josh Jacobs. We talked about this one on the Man vs. Machine recap. Hopefully you guys caught that. I wasn't really too excited about Josh Jacobs until Marshawn Lloyd had like the worst offseason / camp ever. And at that point, the idea that there would be a timeshare in Green Bay, I thought mostly went out the window, despite Matt LaFleur's historical tendencies. So I ended up getting in on Jacobs pretty decently, but right from the jump, I mean, Evan was all over Josh Jacobs this season. That turned out to be a massive hit. Evan, any takeaways going forward for you on what happened with Josh Jacobs?
Well, he was a player that the Packers invested heavily in before the season in free agency. He was a player that was jumping into a situation, you want to talk about elevating offenses, obviously not to the extent that we talked about Saquon Barkley going from the Giants to the Eagles, but going from the Raiders to the Packers, that was a really, really nice jump. We talked before the season with Brandon Thorne about how strong the Packers were as a run blocking unit, and they really leaned on the run this year. Jordan Love came out the gates throwing some picks, and they leaned heavily on their running game, and they were super, super effective all season, whether it be, it didn't even matter which quarterback was under center. They were running the ball successfully with volume. We knew that Josh Jacobs could play in the passing game. He had that history of bell cow usage. He's a player that is sort of like divisive in the fantasy community. I've gone back and forth on him myself. There have been times where I'm like, I don't think he's very good. But the last we had seen him, he had a really nice season. He had a great season in his first year with the Packers.
Yeah, and one thing that I wanted to take away on Josh Jacobs is that ability to carry big workloads is a skill, right? Like, not all running backs can do it, and not all running backs have proven they can do it. And like Josh Jacobs, whether you think he's good or he's bad, coaches continually to give him the ball 20 plus times a game. And maybe that should be baked more into my analysis, at least. Like, yeah, he's not that good, but you know what? He can carry the ball 20 times and be effective at it and keep the job. So yeah. Okay, bad miss here. Dalton Kincaid. I thought that Trey McBride and Kincaid during the pre-draft process were really close. I had McBride ahead, but not by much. And that was a really rough take. I mean, and you could boil it down really simply, Evan. You could just say one was a Mackey Award winner, the other isn't. But I did not foresee, like, they were so thin, and it worked out like that. Buffalo needed pass catching. They needed weapons so bad. And I thought Kincaid would be the one to step up, and he just didn't. And maybe the takeaway is just talent evaluation. He's just not good enough to do it. Maybe that's the takeaway. I'm not sure. But yeah, Evan, any thoughts on what happened with Dalton Kincaid this year?
Yeah, it just seemed like the seas were parting for him. No Stephon Diggs, no Gabe Davis, that the seas were parting for him to take a really big leap with so many unproven pass catchers in the Buffalo receiver core, and really nobody wound up really stepping up. I mean, I think you could say that Khalil Shakir to an extent, but it certainly wasn't Dalton Kincaid, and he was in that group of, I don't know, what would you say, like 5th round tight ends?
Yep.
And he was one of the biggest misses among them. A 1st round tight end drafted by a team that drafts well. And again, all that opportunity, and he like flubbed it. I'm not willing to, I'm not ready to write him off, because we've seen so many times throughout the years, tight ends just take a little bit longer than other
Well,
positions.
yep.
But I mean, we didn't see signs of progress here in year 2 from Dalton Kincaid.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about the overarching theme at tight end, because people who spent fantasy capital at tight end this season, Kelsey, who I know both of us had a big fade on, and that was a hit that we didn't talk about, but Kelsey, Laporta, Andrews to some degree, Kincaid, Pitts, Evan Ingram, Ferguson, they all fail to some degree. Now, McBride and Kittle were huge hits, and they separate so massively at the tight end position, which is why people continue to do it. But man, my strategy for so long has been find the mid-round tight end, and Njoku or Bowers or whatever last season, or find a late-round tight end and not invest in this position so early, because it's so unpredictable, not just on a year-to-year basis, but on a week-to-week basis. I mean, my God, it's really hard to get the tight end position right. And so I regret a little bit, like I took so many tight ends in that round 4, 5, 6 range, and when I got McBride or Kittle was a smash. When I got the other guys, it was just a disaster. So, yeah, just thinking about the tight end position this coming up season, really hard about what I want my strategy to be at tight end. I think is going to be super important. Okay, one of the best hits that we had here, as we get to kind of the backer side of the early rounds, Chase Brown. I mean, probably the best hit that we had. I had Chase Brown on, I think, like literally every team. Redraft had like 35% or more in best ball. Just an explosive player that can carry a workload, as we saw in college. Zach Moss ended up getting hurt, which helped the run out. But yeah, the lesson for me, and this every year, timeshare backs in good offenses that are more talented than the guy they're competing with. And that just like hit Chase Brown to a T. Now, we'll get to Jalen Warren. I thought that was the same kind of archetype. That wasn't it. Javonte Williams, the same kind of archetype. That wasn't it. Blake Corum, the same kind of archetype. Trey Benson, Charbonnet. These guys can miss, but this is still the archetype that I want to take, because when it hits like Chase Brown hits, it can hit in a massive way. So yeah, Evan, any thoughts on the way Chase Brown ran out?
Yeah, I was really, really high on Chase Brown. Like you said, I had him on a ton of teams as well. To me, it seemed like he was being pigeonholed as this guy after his rookie year. He was being pigeonholed as this player who could only be a rotational back. But if you look back at his college history, he had 330 carries his final year at Illinois in 12 games, and 27 catches as well. So he had shown in the Big Ten a true workhorse profile, and he's not like particularly small. He's 209 pounds. So I was just like, look, man, I know he's better than Zach Moss. I know that this offense is super stable. And if he gets this job, I just thought that he would gradually over time overtake Zach Moss. Zach Moss gets hurt. Chase Brown becomes a league winner.
Yeah.
To me, this was another situation where it was like, he's going to give you some level of production. He's got a little bit of a floor, and he's got a massive ceiling, and he wound up hitting that ceiling hard.
For sure. And he got a very clean run out, and not all these archetypes hit, but I'm sure that I'm going to be on this archetype of running back once again when they're going in round 8, 9, 10, 11. We'll get to some misses in that range coming up. Speaking of misses, Rome Odunze, I don't want to spend a lot of time on, because we talked about him a bunch on Man vs. Machine. I'm not sure if Rome himself was a bad pick where he was going, or we just overestimated this offense. I mean, honestly, my biggest regret on the Rome stuff isn't Rome or a bad Caleb Williams evaluation or whatever. It's the Shane Waldron, aka fraudulent stuff. I mean, we knew this. JSN said it. I mean, JSN went on camera and said how much of a fraud Shane Fraudron is. And
did you see that? Did you see that JSN did another interview and was given the opportunity to clear the air, and he basically said the same thing?
If you guys want to see that, I retweeted it. It's so funny. I mean, they asked him like, "Do you want to say anything about the Shane Waldron situation?" He basically said the same thing over again a year later. It's so good. But yeah, so I also think there's some can I be wrong about my offensive coordinator evaluations? Sure. We'll get to Jaden Daniels and Cliff Kingsbury here in a little bit, but guys that I really hate, like Waldron and Hackett, and there's just so many. I don't want to get too high on guys that are tied to these coordinators. So I think you just don't know what they're doing. And there was a lot of Rome buzz for sure. I mean, especially in best ball, he was going round 7, round 6, stuff like that. And that was probably too pricey. Bears as a whole, though, Evan, underperformed massively. Any takeaways for you on that or the Rome stuff?
Well, we talked about it on Man versus Machine. If you had given me 2 data points on Rome Odunze before the season, his air yards and his playing time, my God, I would have been high on him like Leone was.
Yeah.
I wound up being fairly low on him. So I actually considered him sort of a hit.
Yeah.
But the takeaway for me was just how inefficient this Bears offense was. You listen to the radio around here and they're like, oh, well, Caleb had 21 touchdowns and 6 interceptions or whatever. The reality of it was that this was a super hyper inefficient passing game, and Rome Odunze was one of the culprits.
Yeah.
I mean, he got a ton of air yards and a ton of playing time, and he did very, very little with it.
Absolutely. Speaking of wide receiver hits in this range, Jackson Smith and Jigba was a hit for us. Part of that barbell running back strategy allowed you to hammer wide receiver through this range. Jackson Smith and Jigba came into his second season at just 22 years old. He's freed from Shane Waldron. Hopefully his ADOT improved. Lockett falls off a cliff. And that is like exactly what happened. And so lesson for me is like coordinator stuff. It matters. And competition age matters. I mean, Tyler Lockett really fell off a cliff. JSN ends up catching 100 balls on 8.1 targets per game. Him out targeting DK Metcalf was something that surprised me, even though I was on JSN. JSN averaged 8.1 targets per game. DK Metcalf only 7.2. So I know this was a bold prediction for Evan before the season. This would be exactly what happened with JSN. So a big hit here, Evan. Any takeaways on the JSN stuff?
Yeah, the writing was on the wall a little bit in 2023 for Tyler Lockett. And I think that we've seen that DK Metcalf is just sort of like a limited player. So the C's did part here for JSN, and he took advantage. My takeaway is just listen to Brian Hartline. Whatever Brian Hartline says, do that. By the way, I think Brian Hartline, he got a promotion, I believe. Maybe promoted to offensive coordinator at Ohio State, I believe.
There's a new kid at Ohio State. He was a freshman this year who went nuts. I wonder what Brian Hartline's evaluation will be on him versus JSN versus Marvin Harrison versus all the other Ohio State, Olave, all the other Ohio State wide receivers. I'm interested to hear.
Jeremiah Smith.
Yeah.
He should be in the NFL right now, actually.
Brian Hartline actually listens to this show weekly. And so if you're listening, Brian Hartline, let us know what you think of Jeremiah versus the other Ohio State wide receivers. Okay, last one here in the early rounds. This guy cost me like a small fortune. I mean, my God, I just kept going back to the well on CJ Stroud. Not just, I lost most of my money on CJ Stroud in DFS, but I lost a decent amount in best ball also. Given what Stroud did as a rookie, which I thought was insanely impressive, then you go get him Steph Diggs. You get Tank Dell back from the broken leg. I just thought it was a really high floor situation. Get the pass rate up higher, get more explosive plays. That's not what happened. I mean, their pass rate didn't go up. And I know what everyone's going to say. It's Adam, you don't get it. It's not Stroud's fault. It's the offensive line. There's plenty of quarterbacks out there with bad offensive lines that overcome it and have really good seasons. So I do have a take about like the math and projection stuff on Stroud, which I want to get to here in a second. But just from an NFL perspective, Stroud took a massive step back. Evan, any takeaways for you on what happened to CJ Stroud in his sophomore year?
I definitely think that I wouldn't just draw a straight line to the offensive line. I would draw a bit of a line to Bobby Slowick, who wound up getting fired for being unable to scheme away from unblocked pressure because the Texans gave up so much unblocked pressure. I think that CJ Stroud got rattled. The Tank Dell injury, Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins missed time. It was just a very disappointing season. I say that as someone who had, Super Bowl tickets on the Texans and MVP tickets on CJ Stroud. I was expecting a massive year 2 for him, and I too was wrong about CJ Stroud. But I do think it's a good thing that they got rid of Bobby Slowick, because allowing free pass rushers at your second year quarterback, like that's not okay.
Yeah. From a like fantasy and like projection and modeling perspective, we did have a huge fade on Stroud, and we kept looking at it before the season, looking at the math, and like where he was going, just you could not get there on straight math because CJ Stroud doesn't run, right? And like on these pocket quarterbacks, it's really hard. You need so much volume and so much efficiency. And then, you're relying on that really in a big way. And if anything goes wrong, you have nothing to fall back on. And so the pocket quarterbacks, you better be really, really, really sure. Like if you're taking CJ Stroud ahead of Jaden Daniels, which we'll get to soon, which I did a few times for sure. I probably did more than a few times. Like that's really bad because you better be really, really sure that CJ Stroud is going to be crazy efficient. He ends up with a YPA 22nd in the league. That's like Will Levis, Trevor Lawrence range. He only had 20 touchdown passes in 17 games. I understand offensive line. I understand wide receiver injuries. But yeah, I kind of regret ever being that high on a pocket passer, just for fantasy, on a raw pocket passer without that kind of efficiency. Brian Thomas was just an absolute massive hit. My teams that ended up with Brian Thomas and Chase Brown, and there were a lot of them, those were by far my best teams. And I think the thesis on Brian Thomas was simply, for me at least, he was getting overshadowed. The wide receiver class was so strong. Everybody excited about Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, Roma Dunze. Brian Thomas, in his own right, was a crazy size speed prospect, crazy big play production in college. And I also think people overthought that. And I also think they overthought the competition. Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, Gabe Davis. Yeah, I think they're all okay, but not like dominant or great NFL players. So this was like very little opportunity cost to take a shot on Brian Thomas. Evan, any takeaways for you on BTJ's rookie season?
Yeah, I think that I was a little bit closer to market average with Brian Thomas. You were super high on him. In particular, I think Leone was really high on him as well. It's funny, he had some really nice games with Trevor Lawrence. He went ballistic with Mac Jones
Yeah.
at quarterback. But I think it's just a bet on talent. This guy led the nation in touchdown catches in his final season at LSU. He was like sort of like a late bloomer. He was a basketball player. But that's great for athleticism. He tore up the combine. He was he's a first round pick in the draft.
Right.
And as you mentioned, his competition really wasn't that stiff. Christian Kirk, of course, wound up getting injured. But yeah, I mean, I think he was an easy guy to take in the mid to late rounds.
Yeah. And, the takeaway here for me is really simple. At this point in the draft, round 10, round 11, round 12, you don't want safety. Like unknown is good, ambiguity is good. And Brian Thomas had so much of that. There was like asymmetric upside because if he fails, if he stinks, whatever, we'll drop him and we'll move on. He was only a 10th, 11th, 12th round pick. If he hits as he did, it's just so good and he can hit in such a big way. And like, I do not want to underestimate first round draft capital. It doesn't always hit. Keon Coleman didn't hit. Plenty of guys didn't. Marvin Harrison didn't hit. Plenty of guys don't hit. But man, Lad McConkey, Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors, like rookies step right into the NFL these days, the wide receiver position, and produce in a big way. Let's go to a later round running back that was a miss for us. I went back and forth on Javonte Williams. I ended up late in the process being in on him, and I just regret it. I thought he was going pretty late for what was a really good scheme for him, pass catching, etc. I think maybe the takeaway, Evan, is just I need to be better on talent evaluation because if Javonte Williams is going to lose carries to Jaleel McLaughlin, like between the tackles carries, if that's even in the range of outcomes that Javonte can lose between the tackle carries to Jaleel McLaughlin, I mean, that's just bad. So maybe it was just a bad talent evaluation on Javonte Williams. Evan, any thoughts on the way it went for Javonte?
I also wound up being relatively in on Javonte Williams as like an 8th, 9th round pick. And that just, he didn't help you. They had Audric Estime, who they also gave sporadic carries to. Jaleel McLaughlin clearly outplayed him. The offensive line had a great season in Denver this year, and the Broncos had a surprisingly very good season. Bo Nix was better than anybody expected, and Javonte Williams still failed. So, yeah, I think that this was a talent evaluation issue.
Okay. Let's go to a hit at the running back position in that range. Both of us were really outside of the market, but both of us had zero interest in Jonathan Brooks. And a lot of sharp people that I really respect were in on Jonathan Brooks at his cost. And like their argument was clear. We don't really get access to talented, eventual, assumed workhorse backs in round 8 or 9. I think Evan and I were always skeptical that one, Jonathan Brooks was an elite running back prospect even before the ACL injury. Two, Chuba Hubbard would just go away. And three, it's hard. It's not impossible, but it's hard for running backs to succeed on a really bad team. And along with that, like my biggest thing was, what's the point of pushing Brooks on that knee when you're 3-10, which is what I kind of expected the Panthers to be. Now, that played out well for us. Unfortunately, Brooks had a slow rehab. They were cautious, as they should be, as was just part of the thesis. And then he goes down again. We were certainly wrong on running backs performing on bad teams, though, because Chuba was a smash and someone I was not really that in on, but he absolutely smashed as like a 14th or 15th round pick. But yeah, just being out on Jonathan Brooks ended up being a huge hit. Evan, any more takeaways on what happened there?
I just think it's a lesson in betting against players coming off of significant late season injuries and making the jump from college to the pros.
Yeah.
So and being on a bad team. So there were just a lot of factors working against Jonathan Brooks and too many factors working against him for me to be particularly high on. I also was out on Jonathan Brooks before the season.
Yeah. And like the thing about Chuba Hubbard, and you can say, oh, I don't want to take, and we'll get to Zamir White here, but I don't want to take like bad running backs on bad teams. First of all, I'm not sure Chuba Hubbard is bad, but second of all, the opportunity cost is way different. Chuba Hubbard, as I said, 14th, 15th round pick. I probably should have been on him somewhat there, and that was a mistake, especially if I was going to be out on Jonathan Brooks. All right. This next one, man, I hate myself for this one so bad. I did not have enough. I was not high enough on Jaden Daniels. I think I was like in line with the field in best ball, but man, I breathe to get elite rushing quarterbacks in the later rounds of fantasy football drafts. Like nothing gets me to the full 3.9 inches like that. And it used to be easy, before people were kind of woke in the fantasy community to how outrageous the floor ceiling combos of rushing quarterbacks are. Now it's hard. But Jaden Daniels is available in round 8 or round 9, and not smashing him every time there was just really, really, really bad. And I think I know why. I'm curious on Evan's take, but I'll let him go here. But I think I know why I wasn't. But yeah, Evan, any takeaways on Jaden Daniels? I actually don't remember where you were at exactly on Jaden Daniels. This one, I more thought of as me. Just I was okay with him, but I should have been like smashing him.
That's exactly how I felt that I was on him. And I mean, this is a player who led the nation in his final season at LSU in yards per pass attempt and yards per rushing attempt. So that dynamic ability was clearly there. We overthought the situation. We were worried about the offensive line. They really only had one, fairly big time weapon in Terry McLaurin. You hate Cliff Kingsbury like with a passion. I think he's going to be a future NFL head coach again. I'm kidding on that.
Yeah,
sort of. But we overthought the situation. We put too much emphasis on the situation and not enough on the player. This is a situation where we absolutely can learn something, I think.
Yeah. And I think, looking back, I wasn't sure that Jaden Daniels was an elite rusher, right? And I think some of the prospect bros got this wrong. Like my biggest question anytime we talk to
a bunch of the prospect bros got Jaden Daniels wrong.
Yeah,
Yes.
I just mean as a rusher. Like I don't even mean as like an NFL player. I mean how close to Lamar. I remember asking this question of like every prospect bro I talked to, how close to Lamar Jackson as a runner do you think Jaden Daniels will be in the NBA, in the NFL? And a lot of the consensus was he's not. He's nowhere near Lamar Jackson as a rusher. As it turned out, Jaden Daniels ran 148 times for 891 yards and 6 touchdowns. Lamar Jackson this year ran 139 times, 915, and 4 touchdowns. So that was the first part. Like if I thought that he would be anywhere near Lamar Jackson as a runner, I would have been higher. And just like the unknown there and what Evan said about the yards per attempt rushing in college, I should have just been on it and taken the risk on it. And second, the combo of, as Evan said, poor weaponry, I thought, plus I thought Cliff would be inept on the Waldron scale. And, these offensive coordinators, and that's what I was talking about with Waldron, like I can, just like I can get a player evaluation wrong, I can get an offensive coordinator evaluation wrong. I'm not convinced that Cliff is some genius now. I thought a lot of what the Commanders did this year was just Jaden Daniels' brilliance. But obviously, I'm reconsidering my takes on Cliff now, and I'm open to being wrong on offensive coordinators, just like I'm open to being wrong on players. So, yeah, this one really, really hurt. And like anytime we have access to a rushing quarterback in round 8+, I'm just going to close my eyes and take it. I'm just going to close my eyes and take it because it can go so well as it did for Jaden Daniels. All right. Another miss, Jaylen Warren. This wasn't a huge miss. You could have used Jaylen Warren in deeper leagues somewhat, but I thought it'd be better than the way it ran out. I thought Arthur Smith would come in and see that Jaylen Warren was better than Najee Harris. And even if he didn't, I just expected an insane amount of running back touches in this offense, and Jaylen Warren would be fine. And then obviously he'd be great, I thought, if Najee Harris went down. It just didn't play out like that. Najee never got hurt. He averaged 15.5 carries, while Jaylen Warren only averaged 8 carries per game. Warren missed out on all the goal line work. It was never like exciting to put Jaylen Warren in your lineup, even though I thought he was a really strong pick there right around Chase Brown and guys like that. Evan, any takeaways for you on the Jaylen Warren stuff?
He definitely fits an archetype of running back that appeals to us because he can play in the passing game. And he is a really quality. I mean, the year before, he was one of the best tackle-breaking running backs in the NFL. The reason that I had skepticism on Jaylen Warren was because of Arthur Smith, because Arthur Smith had no previous ties to Jaylen Warren. Before the season, he was talking up Najee Harris as reminds him of Derrick Henry, who, of course, Arthur Smith had in Tennessee. So I was never super confident in Jaylen Warren because of the coaching situation.
Yeah. And it's like the Najee stuff is a reminder that it's not what we think of players. It's not what the analytics or the stats or the media or anyone thinks of players. Coaches like giving the ball to Najee Harris, and so
especially coaches like Arthur Smith.
Right. Coaches like Arthur Smith like giving the ball 100%. Also in that range, I just want to touch on Blake Corum because as looking back through my best ball portfolio, I had a ton of Blake Corum. And I don't think this was bad, just a simple handcuff play. And Kyron never got hurt. Now, Corum remains, I think, in that style of running back that I want to draft. A rookie, team invested in him. Starter is not the most efficient player. Starter has had injuries. And if Blake Corum, if you do get this job, the Rams running back job, the usage is just smash. So I'm not trying to necessarily regret the Blake Corum play, but it just ran straight into a brick wall. I mean, it never got going whatsoever. Evan, any thoughts on what happened with Blake Corum's rookie season?
I just think that it's a lesson in Sean McVay freaking loves Kyron Williams.
Yeah.
And he's going to ride him until it's over. And it never ended this year. So
yeah.
Blake Corum just never got in there, really.
The crazy thing is Kyron Williams had fumble problems this year and was not that efficient. I mean, Kyron fumbled a ton.
And when Blake Corum was in, I thought he looked pretty good. He just didn't get the opportunities.
Yeah, and I believe Kyron Williams was under 4 yards per carry, 4.1 yards per carry this season. So he wasn't that efficient, and he was fumbling, and still Blake Corum never got a chance. So, yeah, for sure, this McVay stuff, he gets real sticky to his running backs. All right. Good hit here in the wide receiver position. Another good hit at wide receiver in the later rounds. Jameson Williams, I thought an easy one here. We talked about it a ton over the offseason. You could see the team really starting to believe in JMO late in the 2023 season. Environment is so strong. Talent is so freakish. Every time I question myself on Jameson Williams, I just went back and looked at his stats and highlights from Alabama in 2021. It was so crazy. But yeah, I think an easy one here, Evan. And yeah, the steam got a little bit high in best ball, but in redraft, you could get Jameson Williams real late, and that was a big hit. Any more takes on JMO's season?
Well, the big knock against him was that the previous season he didn't earn a heavy share of targets, but man, they cleared the path for him in 2024. And as you mentioned, he was an awesome college player. I mean, they took him 12th overall in the draft, despite the fact that he was coming off a major injury. He had that stupid suspension. There was just all these extenuating circumstances that got in the way and created obstacles for him. Amon-Ra St. Brown earns 1 million targets. Sam Laporta earns 1 million targets. You got the 2 running backs there. This was a bet on talent situation. And you could say bet on situation because they again, they cleared the path for him to be the locked in number 2 receiver, like without any competition. So
Yeah.
they were screaming at you that they wanted to make Jameson Williams work, and they did want to make him work, and they made him work, and he answered. I mean, he had a really, really nice season for them.
Yeah. For sure. Let's go to Zamir White. I don't want to spend a ton of time here. If you watch the Man vs. Machine recap video, which I hope you guys all went on YouTube and watched Man vs. Machine recap, it was so good. But we talked a bunch about Zamir White on that one already. You know, like, I think that this whole idea, is the dead zone still a thing in fantasy football as people have adjusted to it? Pricing on running backs have adjusted. Is it still a thing? I think in certain kinds of backs, it's still a thing. I don't want to say that it is a thing for everyone. Every running back between rounds 3 and 7 is bad now, because I don't think that's true. And that hasn't been true for the last couple of years. But on guys like Zamir White, who we really just, he wasn't going to play in the passing game. We really just need a lot of volume and touchdowns. And he was on the Raiders. That to me was like dead zone-ish. Evan, I know we already beat you up on this one on Man vs. Machine, but any final thoughts on Zamir White?
The extent of my analysis going into 2024 was based on a 4-game sample at the end of the previous season where Antonio Pierce rode Zamir White hard, and that was not good analysis on my part. This is something that I should have known at the time. Leone was all over my ass about this one. He was right. I was wrong. It was bad analysis. I blew it, and I'm sorry.
Let's go to one that you had a good hit on. Rachaad White was on the shy away list, and Bucky Irving was a target here. And, you know, that turned out to be massive. You know, if you got on those teams where you took late round shots on Brian Thomas, Bucky Irving, and Chase Brown, those were like the best possible teams that you could have down the stretch. And I think we were on those guys in like a really big way. I thought I liked Bucky. I took a decent amount of Bucky. I wasn't as in on him as Evan was, just because I thought even if it went bad for Rachaad White would still dominate pass down work. And it turned out that Bucky was just so much better. They could not keep Bucky off the field. Evan, any more takeaways on what went down with the Bucky Rachaad stuff this season?
Well, I mean, I didn't know that Bucky Irving was going to be that good. I mean, Bucky Irving was a sensational player as a rookie for the Tampa Bay Bucks, but he was in this sort of bucket of running backs in the middle to late rounds that they didn't cost you very much, and they were in situations that were more favorable than might meet the eye initially. Rachaad White was not good. He was pretty good in fantasy in 2023 because he got a million touches and he rarely came off the field, but he was not good. They had one of the worst running games in the NFL by some efficiency metrics in 2023, the worst running game in the NFL. And we know that Todd Bowles wants to run the ball, and it was a bet against Rachaad White, and it was a bet on a player who I didn't know that he would be that good of a runner, but I knew that he could play in the passing game. And I knew that he was a tough runner. He had good broken tackle numbers coming out of college. Yeah. So it was largely a bet on the situation and a bet against Rachaad White, and all that wound up working out.
Yeah, I think Evan's point about you can't just look at fantasy points when you evaluate a player's season, because Rachaad White, as Evan said, racked up a ton of fantasy points in 2023. That does not mean the team is committed to him. And you could see in underlying stats that Rachaad White, as Evan said, was not very good in 2023. 3 more here to get to. First one is Deontay Johnson as a miss. I didn't really have a take on Deontay. I didn't draft much of him because I didn't hate him, but I was just real skeptical on Bryce Young. Plus, Deontay's yards per target and fantasy points per target in Pittsburgh was just so bad. And like going to Carolina, I was like, man, is that really going to solve it? But I didn't have a huge take on him. I think Evan was a little bit higher on Deontay. Evan, any thoughts on Deontay Johnson's season, which turned out he played for like 4 teams this season or something insane?
Yeah, I mean, I'm worried about his mental state. I was really high on him. I thought that he was a shoo-in to get a ton of targets in Carolina, and I don't know what happened. Something happened upstairs with him this year. Yeah. He cost himself an incredible amount of money, and I don't know. I wonder if he's even out of chances in the NFL at this point.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Something definitely went haywire. Maybe that's just an outlier situation that we can't evaluate that well, because Bryce did end up coming on in the second half of the year and playing really well. And if Deontay Johnson was there for that and had his head on straight, he probably would end up being okay. All right, 2 more here were late round quarterbacks, and this was more for best ball than redraft. First one was Bo Nix as a hit. He was my most drafted quarterback in best ball. Just find a quarterback who can run, and maybe he runs into some passing efficiency. And it's kind of like the Jaden Daniels thing on a smaller scale, because Bo Nix was going in round 15, 16, 17. Bo Nix ran for 38 touchdowns in 61 college games, but like no one was giving him credit for it. And like, yeah, he wasn't elite as a runner as a rookie, but 430 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns, that gives you a floor. And then we get lucky and he outperforms as a thrower, almost 4,000 yards throwing and 29 touchdown passes. So I didn't think he'd be that good as a thrower. But the reason I was taking Bo Nix is like, I think he can get me some rushing points, and maybe he'll hit as a thrower and I'll have something here. So that's a lesson for me. Just late round, maybe he can run, take it and close your eyes. Evan, any more thoughts on Bo Nix's pretty impressive rookie season?
Pound for pound, adjusted for draft cost, Bo Nix might have been like, he was definitely one of your biggest hits in 2024. And you outlined all the reasons perfectly beforehand. You didn't even mention here that, oh, let's bet on Sean Payton, who has a great track record coaching up quarterbacks. But yeah, I mean, the rushing, he outperformed as a passer. That offensive line was one of the best in the league at pass protection. The prospect evaluations were all over the map on Bo Nix. We had Mike Renner on. He compared him to like Tony Romo. You had Nate Tice, who does a great job, but compared him to Taylor Heineke. So the draft prospects evaluation of him was all over the map. I didn't know what to think about of him really as a player. You remember they got ripped for taking him. Where did they take him? 12th overall.
Yeah.
That was like almost like a joke. Like almost everyone knew that was going to happen, and people were laughing about it. Wound up being a very fine pick.
Yeah.
So I didn't really know what to think about him as a player. So I never really went hard, big or small on him. You went big on him though. I think you got him on a ton of best ball teams, right?
For sure. Yeah. And like, I think a lesson for me is prospect. It's so hard to evaluate college prospects, how they're going to be in the NFL. So hard. And just because a bunch of prospect bros don't like Bo Nix, that's not going to like shy me away from taking him in the 16th or 17th round. You know what I mean? Like the Broncos thought enough of him to take him 12th overall. That means way more to me than how a lot of these like tape bros are going to think about it. Last one was a big hit for Evan, and I took a bunch of this guy, also late round quarterback, Sam Darnold. There are just some systems and personnel setups where it's really hard for the quarterback to fail. 49ers to some degree, I think, fits that mold. Vikings to a massive degree. And we've seen Nick Mullins, Josh Dobbs have huge fantasy games playing in this Vikings setup. You're in a dome. You have Kevin O'Connell. You have Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, Aaron Jones, TJ Hawkinson. Even if you thought Sam Darnold sucks, it's kind of hard for him to completely fail. Now, I did not think that he would be like in the MVP conversation for some of the year, but it was hard for him to fail. And he was going in like the last round, even after JJ McCarthy's injury. So yeah, Evan, big hit here on Sam Darnold for late round quarterback and 2 quarterback league bros. Any more thoughts on the Darnold play?
Yeah, it was very much rooted in the situation. I mean, he has talent. He was the number 3 overall pick in the draft. We always know, and he flashed, and his situations were always horrible with the Jets, Carolina previously. He's playing in a dome. He's playing for Kevin O'Connell. He's got Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson. Aaron Jones. He's got that ability. And they had a really nice schedule as well entering the season. Yeah. So it was very much a bet on the situation. I know that we think, what the taste that it is left in our mouth has to do with the absolute meltdown in his final 2 games. But Sam Darnold had a really, really nice season. Certainly the best season of his career. And I think that he was at least worthy of some MVP consideration up until the meltdown in the final 2 games.
Yep, for sure. Big hit there on Sam Darnold. All right. That is going to do it for our look back at our biggest hits and misses from the 2024 season. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Again, the point isn't to brag or victory lap or hate ourselves or needle or anything like that. I'm hopeful that this was helpful for you guys to try to think going forward about things we can do better when we're evaluating fantasy prospects for next season and going forward. I know it definitely helps me a ton. We'll be back with regular shows weekly here on this free feed. Be sure to subscribe to the free feed all offseason as free agency approaches, and of course, our YouTube. For Evan, Bruce, Ryan, Bruce, Luke, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.